Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. Chapter 7, July. Speculation about Holly Lodge grew keener as the weeks passed. The preliminary announcement of its sale by auction, unless privately sold beforehand, whetted all appetites. Mrs. Pringle had heard from an unspecified source, but she told me it was as true as she stood there, that nothing under £50,000 would be considered. Mr. Willett observed that people must need their heads examined when it came to buying houses these days, and Reg Thorne said he could remember when Holly Lodge belonged to that miserable old faggot that drove a Liverpool phaeton. His name was on the tip of his tongue, but he reckoned it had gone for the moment. Anyway, when he had died, and no one mourned his going, that was a fact, Holly Lodge went for 600 to a nice old party from the other side of Caxley. 600, mark you! Later in the morning, he drew aside the tarpaulin, sending a shower of dried paint and wood splinters upon us, poked his face through the gap, and said, "Potter, that was the name, Josiah Potter, and a nasty bit of work he was, too." He then withdrew, allowing me to send Ernest out to the lobby for the dustpan and brush, whilst I continued my interrupted discourse on medieval farming methods. The sale of Holly Lodge occupied the inhabitants of Fairacre very pleasurably. The history of the house, the quirks of its various owners, and, of course, the scandalous amount of money being asked for at the moment, were all mulled over with the greatest enjoyment. Whether any would-be purchasers had inspected the house was difficult to say. Holly Lodge was a little distance from the center of the village and well hidden from prying eyes by the high hedge which gave the house its name. It was one of Fairacre's more retired establishments, and, as Mrs. Pringle remarked wistfully, "It's difficult to find out what goes on in there." It so happened that I met Miriam Quinn and Joan Benson on separate occasions within a week. I had gone into Caxley on one sunny Saturday morning to buy a pair of summer shoes, and was still reeling from the shock of the amount I had just handed over, when I bumped into Miriam Quinn. She commiserated with me. "I can sympathize. I've just come from inspecting cotton frocks, and have decided that my present shabby collection can do another year, if not 2 or 3. I asked after Joan. "Run off her feet at the moment with people coming to view. She won't have any difficulty in disposing of it, I'm sure, but she does so want to see it in good hands. Half the viewers have appalling plans for turning it into flats or a home for delinquent boys or some such." I said it must be a trying time for them both. "Well, there it is. I haven't found anything remotely suitable for myself, and now I'm at the limbo stage, telling myself I may as well wait and see, and perhaps something will turn up. Somehow one gets numb after a bit." "Maybe that's nature's protection," I said as we parted. Joan Benson I met in the village a day or two later. She was struggling with an overloaded carrier bag which had collapsed under the strain and only had one handle intact. "I really should have brought the car, but I thought it would do me good to walk on such a heavenly day. In any case, I only intended to buy about 4 things, and now look at me. Here, put some in my basket and come back with me, and I'll let you have a good tough bag. I'm going to have a cup of tea anyway, so do join me." The children had gone home, and I had been to the post office to send off a couple of urgent missives to the office, which would probably not be opened for days if I knew anything about it. Over tea, Joan told me more about the horrors of selling a home. "I don't know which is worse, trying to find a home or trying to get rid of one. For 2 pins, I'd call the whole thing off and just stay at Holly Lodge until I'm carried out feet first." "There would be general rejoicing if you did decide to stay," I told her. "Well, that's nice to hear, but I really must be sensible and look ahead. This wretched arthritis gets steadily more troublesome, and sometimes I find it quite difficult to get upstairs. And the house is far too big now that I'm alone, and costs the earth to heat. And much as I love gardening, I simply cannot cope with that great one at Holly Lodge, and help gets more and more impossible to find, and more expensive." She sighed and shook her head at the proffered biscuit tin. "What a misery I sound! I'm not really unhappy. I've been so kindly looked after in Fairacre, I shall miss the life here horribly. But my daughter is quite right. If I can't drive, I shall be absolutely done for in Fairacre, and I'm finding it quite painful sometimes. And I'm sorry to say that I am now refusing to drive at night, or if it's foggy or icy. That cuts it down quite considerably, I agreed, and she laughed. But it's selling the house which is the real problem. I don't want Miriam to have to go. She's been quite wonderful to me, and is so happily ensconced in that little annex. If only we could find a nice, quiet family that would be glad to have her there, and people that Miriam could get on with, it would be perfect. But that means selling to someone we know, and so far no one in that category has emerged. And some of the viewers have fairly curdled my blood with their plans for the house. They probably wouldn't get them passed anyway when it came to the point. "But I love that house," cried Joan. "I simply hate the idea of it being torn about. If only some nice couple who like it as it is would appear, I should sell cheerfully. As it is, I still have to find myself somewhere near Barbara. She is quite marvelous about vetting places, but with young children she is very tired, and I feel I must go and stay with her before long to have a good scout round myself." She began to collect her shopping. "I've run on far too long, but you are so sympathetic, and thank you for the delicious tea and the bag, and best of all for listening." On the doorstep she paused. "You won't mention my concern about Miriam, will you? I should hate her to think I was turning buyers away because of her. It's not quite like that, as I'm sure you understand, but she is so independent." Her voice trailed away. "Never fear," I assured her. "I've lived in a village long enough to know how to be discreet, though even then it's sometimes difficult to keep the boat upright." She waved and departed with her burden. Mr. Lamb at the post office unearthed a handful of ancient postcards from the back of a little used drawer. He came across one of Fairacre's school, which he kindly gave me, and I pored over it with a magnifying glass. This photograph must have been taken in the first decade of this century, judging by the dress of the children. They are all gathered in the lane outside the school, and there is not a single piece of traffic in sight. How instantly that picture carried me into a vanished world. The boys are grouped together on one side of the lane, and every one of them wears a cap. Some are in Norfolk breeches, some in short, and some in long trousers. Quite a few have jackets too big for them, some too small, with their bony wrists hanging from tight sleeves, but almost all sport Eton collars and stout boots. The girls, carefully separated from the boys by the width of the lane, wear black stockings and boots, white starched pinafores over their frocks, and some have hats as well. Altogether, there must be around 70 children in this photograph. The staff seems to be hidden by the throng, with the exception of one stolid-looking young man who towers above the girls. I looked in vain for Miss Clare, who must have been there at that time, but either she was absent that day or was engulfed by her charges somewhere at the rear of the party. The school building looked exactly the same, and I recognized several trees as old friends, although considerably shorter. But a magnificent barn, end on to the road, has now gone. The rough grass still grows as thickly as at the edge of the lane, and one small child holds a flower to his face, enjoying its scent forever. With so many memories crowding upon me during this centenary year, I found this scene particularly moving, and shall always be grateful to Mr. Lamb for presenting me with such an irreplaceable treasure. With the end of term in sight, I conferred with Miss Briggs about our plans. It seemed wise to let the parents know in good time about our centenary affairs, especially those who might have costumes to prepare. "After all, it is next term," I pointed out, "and Fairacre folk don't like to be hurried into things." "I should think that seldom happens," replied my assistant. "I've never met such a slow lot of parents. It's about time Fairacre moved with the times and woke up." I was too taken aback by this attack to answer for a moment. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black was my first reaction. "And I'm beginning to wonder," she went on, "if I don't owe it to myself to change to a livelier job." I hardly liked to point out that she had had some months of unemployment before she landed the Fairacre post. Also, that she would need a glowing reference from me, which, in all honesty, I could not supply to take her to another job, and in any case, her probationary year had at least another term to run. If you do decide to try your luck, I said, at last, you know how much notice you must give. But if you'll take my advice, I should get all the experience you can here before you think of changing. Nothing seems to happen here, cried my discontented assistant. I should think Fairacre School was exactly like this 100 years ago. And as far as I can see, it will be exactly the same 100 years hence. Privately, I hoped it would be, but I know full well that the wind of change buffets us daily, and that a school which has shrunk from that thriving community in Mr. Lamb's photograph to 20-odd children who now comprise the school cannot hope to survive long. I think you must make an effort to join some activity or other which you'll enjoy in Caxley, I said. What about the Operatic Society or Caxley Dramatic Club? You like tennis, I know, and there are 2 good clubs in Caxley which you might enjoy. At least you would meet other young people. I know it must be pretty lonely for you here with no other young staff. No one's asked me to join anything, muttered Miss Briggs sulkily. I began to feel my small stock of patience becoming exhausted. Well, of course they haven't. They don't know you're there. Go along to a meeting or find out the name of the secretary and say you want to join. It's up to you. You can't expect these organizations to search the highways and byways. I don't know if I shall have time with all this Centenary fuss to arrange, said Miss Briggs, as though the entire burden of our celebrations rested on her dandruff-sprinkled shoulders. I took a deep breath. Which brings us to the point. You'd better come to tea tomorrow and we'll draft out our plan. I wash my hair tomorrow after school, she said. Far be it from me to stop that, was my unworthy thought. Make it Friday, I said shortly, and got out the register. Amy called the following evening, and I was glad that Miss Briggs was elsewhere attending to her hair. I inquired after the progress of the autobiography. Well, it's uphill work, I can tell you. As you know, I always think one's childhood is the most interesting part of an autobiography, but then where does one begin? I should think, I was born on May the whatever in Nether Wallop or some such. I feel that's too bald. I think people are glad to be told something about one's parents, but I dread going back too far and having 16, if not 32, dubious portraits of forebears on each side. I rather agree. On the other hand, there are some very colorful ancestors on my mother's side. 2 brothers were transported to Australia for stealing sheep and cattle. Amy spoke with considerable pride. Well, put 'em in, I advised. It would certainly swell the volume a little. You've no idea how much writing is needed to make a page of print. It's really quite daunting. I'm thinking of throwing in a distant great-uncle, too. He was defrocked sometime in the last century for conduct not befitting the clergy. Something to do with the choir boys, I gather, but it's so difficult to find any clear evidence after all this time. I had no idea you had such a disreputable background, Amy. My immediate background is blameless, she assured me, and very dull, too. My grandparents and parents seem to have worked hard, kept out of debt, looked after their small families, and generally been worthy and respectable. The consequence is that they make pretty dull reading matter, and I wonder if it might be a good idea to start farther back. I could have a family tree in the front. Does anyone ever look at them? All I find is that having pulled the thing out, it is impossible to fold it correctly again, and you have half a yard of tissue paper in your lap all the time you're reading. That's true, agreed Amy. But going back to your first idea of plunging straight in with one's birth, do you think readers are really gripped by hearing about your being bottle-fed and having your adenoids out, and the way you had hysterics at the age of 4 when Father Christmas kissed you while reeking of whiskey? All those things might create a sympathetic bond, I said. As these confounded educationists tell us ad nauseum, children should be able to identify themselves with the characters they're reading about. Though how you can identify with Sinbad the Sailor or Tom Thumb beats me. Well, all I can say is that I have spent a good hour after tea every day for the past fortnight pushing along my reluctant ballpoint, and I don't suppose I've written enough to fill 4 pages of a real book. It's very disheartening. Cheer up, I said. Think how splendid it will look piled up in the bookshops with queues outside fighting to get in and buy it. And you on television, possibly on This Is Your Life. Just think of that. I refuse to consider it, said Amy firmly. Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, called at the school next morning, and the children sat up with smiles wreathing their faces. They like Mrs. Partridge. I like to think it is for herself alone, as she is a kind, warm-hearted person and devoted to the young, but I have a feeling that she is welcomed more for the bag of boiled sweets which she so often brings with her. Today was no exception, except that the sweets were toffees and not fruit drops. The children's response to this largesse was ecstatic as Patrick handed round the bag. "Now, my dear," said Mrs. Partridge when all were busy sucking, "I wonder if you can do me a favor." What answer is there to that after such generosity? "Of course," I said rashly. "I'm short of collectors for my Save the Children Flag Day next week, and I wondered if you could help." "Where do you want me to go?" I asked, resigned to my lot. "Well, I'm doing from the Beetle and Wedge to the crossroads, and Margaret Waters is doing the other side of the road. And Joan Benson was to have done that outlying part from her house to Tyler's Row, but she has had to hare off to look at a couple of houses her daughter has found. It is that stretch I hope you might find time to do." I agreed to take over Joan's territory, and Mrs. Partridge whipped a piece of paper from the top of the basket she was carrying and placed a collecting tin on my desk with incredible speed. "That's most kind of you, dear," she said briskly. "Could you let me have it back by Thursday? And here is your official badge and the flags." The piece of paper had successfully hidden all these things in the basket, and I noticed yet another collecting tin and more flags, still to be allotted, presumably. "I'll do that," I promised. Bang go the 2 evenings I had earmarked for making strawberry jam and bottling cherries, I thought. She wished the children good-bye, and they replied with their diction somewhat impeded by toffee, but true love shining in their eyes. The door had hardly closed before Eileen Burton was sick on the floor, and one of the Coggs twins began to choke on a large piece of sweet which had gone down the wrong way. I hastily put the collecting box on the windowsill before going to the rescue. Save the children indeed. What about the teachers? Miss Briggs duly stayed late on Friday and accompanied me to the schoolhouse for tea. She appeared somewhat monosyllabic and sulky, but whether she was feeling resentful at staying after school, or whether she was simply being natural, Mr. Willett's "a fair old lump of a girl" came to mind, I could not say. However, she cheered up a little after 3 cups of tea, brown bread and honey, followed by a large slice of Dundee cake, and we settled down with pencils and notebooks to our task. "I think 6 scenes will be ample," I said, "which means something from the reigns of Victoria, Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII, unless we leave him out, George VI, and our present Queen." "Good idea," agreed Miss Briggs, sucking a sticky finger. "If we had a scene for every decade, that would make how many?" 10, I told her. "You ought to know that, child of the metric system as you are." "Yes, well, if we had the scenes lasting only 10 minutes, that would be far too long, wouldn't it?" "My feeling entirely. We can't expect people to sit on the school seats for more than an hour altogether, and if we have a few songs and then tea afterwards, it is as much as the human frame can take." "Have you found some likely stories from the logbook?" "1 or 2. I thought for the first scene we could use the boy Pratt putting on the school clock and being caught by the headmistress." "Lovely. But how will he climb up? Would he pile up the desks?" I repressed a shudder. "No. We'll have Mr. Willett's stepladder to hand. After all, it just may have been left in the schoolroom. And through all the scenes we'll use the old side desk. And the actors will be in period costume, of course. When we get to Elizabeth II, we can push on a modern desk. The old style were in use when I first came here. I must say they were pretty sturdy." "Then what?" asked my assistant, bringing me back to the work in hand. Well, for Edward the Seventh, I thought it would be marvelous if I could say something like, "It was in this reign that a new pupil teacher took up her duties, and in walks Miss Clare." Perfect. And could tell us about her experiences of that time. I've sounded her, and she's game to do it. Frankly, I think it will be the high spot of the whole proceedings. What about George the Fifth? I think it will have to be something to do with the Great War. I told her about Miss Clare's memories of the babies fraying pieces of cotton material to make field dressings. We could enlarge on helping the war effort theme without dwelling unduly on the horrors, which many of the older people in the audience would remember all too well. I wondered if one of the parents who went as a child from Fairacre School to the Wembley exhibition might give an enthusiastic first-hand account of a country child's memories of that memorable Carabanc ride to London in the 20s. Mr. Lamb, perhaps? Or Mrs. Willett? I promised to follow up on the idea. The more we thought about Edward VIII's brief reign, the stronger became our resolve to leave out a scene and simply let the narrator comment on that passage of time. Apart from the abdication, which really had very little mark on the children of the school, there was little to mark the reign's fleeting impression on the village. The 1939-45 war, which followed within 3 years, had much more effect, of course, and we resolved to show the crowded desks with the gas mask boxes lodged thereon and 1 or 2 wartime posters pinned up, as evidently there had been in Mr. Fortescue's session as headmaster at that time. Luckily, Mr. Willett still had 2 precious relics, one showing the results of careless talk and the other of wasting food. There were 1 or 2 incidents in the logbook which could form the basis of a scene, and perhaps Mrs. Austen of Springbourne might be prevailed upon to give her impressions of Fairacre School from an evacuee's point of view. As for our last and present-day scene, what could be better than drawing the audience's attention to the children's exhibition of work in both rooms, singing by the whole school, and the narrator pointing out such facts as the vanishing of those over 11 in the local comprehensive school and cutting down the numbers of Fairacre School drastically after the 1944 Act. Finally, I had asked the vicar if he would appear at the end and remind us all that the church had always played an important part in the 100 years of Fairacre School. He was willing to do this and to end our proceedings with a prayer for blessings received in the past and hopes for the future. "That should take us up to tea very nicely," said Miss Briggs kindly. "We'll all need it by then," I assured her. "And now let's rough out which children would be best as the actors." It took us until nearly 7 o'clock, but we felt it had been worth it. Certainly Miss Briggs departed looking very much more cheerful than when she arrived, and had been surprisingly helpful. And we will continue our way through July next time.